thing. I just have to recopy it. Uh, so, at any rate, we looked at Locke. We saw that for Locke, the mind's a blank slate, a tabula rasa, a blank tablet at birth. Uh, we saw that it's experience after we're born that writes on the tablets, that he rejects innate ideas. Um, we saw that basically the word idea is a technical term for Locke for what the mind immediately perceives. In other words, for Locke, our mind is immediately acquainted with its ideas. That is what he comes to when he buys the same assumption that Descartes bought, that it's really loud out there. I don't feel like talking over the dimmed. That the mind immediately perceives ideas comes to Locke naturally from the assumption that we're in what has been called the egocentric predicament. That is, that the mind, the thought was there's no action at a distance. What the mind immediately is acquainted with must be something inside itself. And so the mind is immediately acquainted with its own ideas for Locke. But this raises for him the same problems with skepticism that Descartes had. If the mind is only acquainted with its own inner mental life, how do we know that the ideas that seem to be coming at us from things external to ourselves really are doing that? How do we know that that's the case? In other words, that there's a real table sitting there that's causing my idea of the table, rather than that I'm in Descartes' dream world, or an evil genius or something is creating these. So this assumption that the mind is acquainted only with its own ideas produces real problems with skepticism for him. But we looked at a couple of distinctions he makes, and again, it seems like this is really nitpicky, picayune stuff, but these distinctions had some profound effects on what philosophers for the next 150 years thought we could justify as far as what we know. And so Locke believes that the mind has both simple and complex ideas, and it's almost like the atomic theory. In other words, a complex idea like the idea we have of the telephone is a collection for us of simple ideas. And these ideas are ideas that relate to the various qualities the object has, right? Its color, its shape, how it feels to the touch, its perceived size, its weight, its sound. And we'll see these qualities relate to what Locke calls primary and secondary properties or qualities. Now, if you can understand this distinction, you'll be able to understand Hume's skepticism, and you'll also be able to understand how Berkeley can be somebody in his right mind and yet hold that there is no such thing as a material world, that all we ever are acquainted with are mental qualities or properties. But for Locke, there is an external material world. And he says that the properties that pertain to that world are what he calls primary properties. But we don't experience only primary properties. We experience a world that also has secondary properties. So what are secondary properties? Well, are things like colors, tastes, smells, feelings of heat and cold, sound. And the point is, for Locke, these are produced in us by the activity of the primary properties of matter. And he knew about atomic structures, right? He, as the video said, was a friend of Newton and Boyle's. So he knew that atoms, the motion of atoms, caused us to have various sensations. But for him, the secondary properties are not really properties of things out there in the world. They're only produced in us by the primary properties of things. So take colors. My dad was colorblind. And I mean, we use that metaphorically for somebody who is not racist, but the literal word means you can't see colors that the rest of us can see. When, you know, and the MVA has ways of testing for this. But presumably when my dad came up to a traffic light, his experience, his inner experience was different from mine. I'm not colorblind. I can see the red, amber, and green colors. And so can most of you, I'm sure. He knew what position the light was in. How? How would you know if you couldn't see the colors? I mean, it's pretty commonsensical, right? You know, what the red's always on top, amber in the middle, and green on the bottom. So he could tell which one was lit up, but he couldn't tell. And you take experiences like this, and they seem to support a position like Locke's, that things like colors are subjective and depend on different perceivers. Tastes. I had a housemate in graduate school, and his idea of a snack was a toasted English muffin, some cottage cheese, and a green bell pepper that he cut the middle out. Now, my mother used to make a dish called stuffed green peppers, where he took a meat and cabbage mixture and you put it in the middle of a pepper shell. I couldn't even go in the house when she was cooking that dish because the very thought or smell of green peppers just would make me gag. Even to this day, I can deal with them if there's a little bit of it as seasoning in something. But what my housemate would have used, you know, eating half a raw green pepper like that, I mean, I wouldn't have gone within 10 feet of one. So we have these different subjective experiences. So you'd have to think that somehow a green pepper, you know, affects my senses different than it would other people who think that they're great. So For Locke, secondary properties weren't really in things, but were subjective and in us. But they were caused by the primary properties. Feelings of heat and cold. This is one of the arguments that Locke uses to try to lend support to his claim that secondary properties aren't really in things, right? We tend to think that warmth and cold are properties of the water. Suppose we had 3 pails of water, and say the one on your left is hot, the one on your right is cold, and the one in the middle is kind of room temperature or just slightly lukewarm, right? Well, now, when I was a kid, I noticed this phenomenon. We had a hill that has since grown over with trees. But when my brother and I were kids, you could actually sled down it if we got a little snow. And my mother used to always buy us these kind of knit gloves that really weren't very effective. I mean, they'd get wet, and so your hands were pretty cold even though you had gloves. And we had separate hot and cold spigots, and it was always easier for me to reach the cold water. So if our mother would call us in for supper after my brother and I had been out sledding, I remember I had the experience of turning on the cold water tap, and my cold hands that had just been out in the snow were so cold that the cold water felt warm. Well, this is the kind of phenomenon Locke's talking about here. Suppose the person doing this test was facing us, and they put their right hand in the hot water, their left hand in the cold water, left it there, for a few minutes till it got accustomed. Now, suppose you took your hand out of the hot water and put it in the lukewarm water. How's that water going to feel? It's just been in hot water. Well, I mean, you can try this yourself, but it will feel cool to the touch. It'll feel cold. Now, you take the hand, though, that's just been in the, say, ice water, cold water, you put that in the lukewarm water, and that hand feels warm, because just like the cold water tap felt to me when I'd come in from the snow. So you say, well, wait a second, the same water can't be both warm and cold at the same time, right? That would be a contradiction. So how do we get out of the contradiction? Well, Locke's answer is we get out of the contradiction of saying that the middle pail of water is both warm and cold at the same time by saying, well, look, warmth and cold are not properties of the water. They only relate to how the water affects us. They're subjective. So warmth and cold are properties in us, not in the water. Now, Locke knows that this is not what the ordinary man or woman on the street thinks. But nonetheless, he and many philosophers and scientists of his day thought that this was the right way to look at things. So here I just described what I went through, so I'm going to skip this. But note, I say we must either conclude that the same water is both hot and cold at the same time, or alternatively conclude that heat and cold are not in the water as properties of it, but are mind-dependent and in us. To say that something is mind-dependent means it can't exist without a mind, that it's subjective and in us. Now, for Locke, it's quite a different story with primary properties. And they are things like the size, shape, molecular texture, motion of things. Take that whiteboard there. For Locke, the color would be subjective and in us. But that it is rectangular, its shape, and the size of it. For Locke, those are actual properties of the real whiteboard in the real world, and they're not subjective and in us. But note, when I look at the whiteboard, I have this mental picture of a rectangular object of a particular size. So for Locke, this is how we know things in the world outside of us. We get a mental picture, and even though the mind only experiences the inner picture, some of the qualities of that picture, like that something is rectangular in shape, actually relate and represent real qualities of real things in a real external world. So our ideas of primary properties then genuinely resemble actual properties in objects themselves. And so we have real knowledge about things. So, so the size of the whiteboard, is actually represented to us, and its shape, and other things like what hardness or softness, motion, that something is moving or at rest. Number, in other words, there's only one legal pad on that table over there. There's only one philosophy book. The number of something is also a primary property. In other words, in the real world, there is only one legal pad there. And so size, number, feelings of hardness, shape, these are primary properties for Locke and really pertain to real objects. So from the point of view of our own experience of something in the world, like, again, we're back to the old landline telephone here. For us, a material object is just a combination of its primary and secondary qualities. However, for Locke, the red color of the telephone is not really in the telephone as a property. Neither would its, say if you touch the telephone, it feels cool to the touch. Heat and coolness are not in the telephone. But it's produced in our minds when we look at it by the motion of the molecules in the real telephone in the real world. However, for Locke, the size of the telephone, its number, its shape, that it feels hard to the touch, hardness, feelings of hardness, that it's capable of motion in the world. All of these are primary properties that are really in the telephone itself. So for Locke then, the world as it appears to us is a world of objects that have both primary and secondary properties. But for Locke, in the actual world, things have only primary properties. But now here's also the problem. Locke's view separates us from the real world. Remember, the mind is never acquainted for Locke with things in the real world. Now, the ordinary person on the street in Locke's day would have disagreed. And probably you would disagree. You say, wait a second, when I look at that whiteboard, I see the whiteboard itself. When I look at the table here, I see the table. But for Locke, that's not what's happening. Say we got 11 of us in here now. Note, my experience of this table from where I am is different from your experience looking at it this way. And those of you who are at the other side are closer to my experience, but not quite the same thing. So note, we have different inner pictures, as it were, of the table. So for Locke, what's going on if 11 of us are perceiving the table is we have 11 subjective mental pictures of the table, but they all represent numerically one real table in the real world, even though we've got 11 different experiences. So we have 11 different pictures, and they all represent, for Locke, something real in the real world. So you say, well, how do I know that my picture is accurate? How do I know that they represent anything? That Descartes isn't right, that I'm dreaming all this. These are problems that arise for Locke because for him we do not perceive the world as it really is. You know, as I say, we perceive a world of primary and secondary properties, but the real world has only primary properties. This is called indirect realism because he thinks there's a real world that exists independently of you and I, right? When you and I were gone over the weekend, for Locke, this table and these desks and chairs, they were here. That whiteboard was here, and so was that one. All this stuff was here, even though none of us was around. There's a real world. The question is, how do you defend that? So indirect realism basically is the view that there is a real world out there, but we never directly experience it. And people like Locke, and even in the early 20th century, thought that the ordinary man or woman on the street is just wrong in their naive belief that when all of us look at that table, we're all numerically seeing one and the same object, directly, not indirectly. However, you saw in that video, people like Hilary Putnam, very big logician and philosopher of science. I was at a philosophy of science convention at Notre Dame, not the one here, the one in Indiana. And Hilary Putnam was going to speak, and you'd have thought a rock star was going to be there. He and and a philosopher in Hume's day named Thomas Reid tried to say, look, you know, the ordinary person on the street is right. We do see things directly. We are not just acquainted with an inner picture of what's going on in the world. We're directly acquainted with things in the world. But in Locke's day and in the early 20th century, when David Hume's views were very popular, the ordinary man or woman on the street was thought to be incredibly naive to think that when we look at a book, we really see a book. And because any educated person knows that all our mind is acquainted with is inner sense data, inner ideas, not with the book itself. These views held sway for a long time. But the problem with a view like Locke's is then we must infer what the real world is like from our inner experiences. But this logical leap becomes unjustified, and it leads to skepticism. It led to Berkeley saying there is no material world, only our subjective ideas. And it led to Hume saying, look, we don't know if there's a material world out there that causes these ideas or not. We can't prove it either way. We ought to just suspend our belief. And philosophers very influenced by Hume, even in the early and middle parts of the 20th century, thought that somebody who would be so brash as to say, I know this table is a real material object in a real world, they're just going way beyond what experience justifies to these people. You know, all I know is my inner sense data, and there's no way I can get from that to saying it represents the world. And this is a problem. You have to make a logical leap. But this leads to skepticism, since the way Richard Rorty used to put it is we can't get out of our own skin. We can't get behind the initial perceptions to check them with the real world. I used to illustrate this way. It's an old illustration. I apologize for that. But in the early 1990s, I was looking for what was state of the art in a VCR at the time, which was, just to say it was a VCR, but a hi-fi stereo VCR, right? So I went into a store in Charlottesville, Virginia, that was like Best Buy or H.H. Gregg, right? And then, of course, there was no such thing as a flat screen TV. I couldn't believe the commercials on the basketball where they got these wallpaper TVs that are like thin. It's like, give me a break. But what was a big screen TV was a glorified projection TV like that, only instead of having the projector outside, it was built inside to a big cabinet, and it's shown at the screen from the back, you know. But they were trying to demonstrate that these TVs had decent color. I remember playing backgammon in hotel bars in the 70s, and they had these projection TVs that were horrible. They were all out of sync, and the colors were terrible. In other words, it was a technology in its infancy. But by the 90s, they had gotten pretty good for what they were, right? And so the way they demonstrated this was they had what path for a home movie camera then, which was as big as the cameras you see them carrying on the sidelines at football games. You'd put a VHS. I remember one of my relatives had one, and he was taking pictures of his kid's birthday party with a camera that was that big. But anyway, they had this camera mounted on a tripod pointed at a doll. And so how would you check to see how good those TVs were in representing the doll? I mean, it's not rocket science, is it, right? If you were in that store, you'd look at the doll in the chair, you'd look at the picture which they were feeding into these various TVs, and you'd compare the picture with the doll, right? To see, are the colors accurate or not? Well, on a view like Locke's, all we have is the picture. That's all our mind is ever acquainted with. We can never get beyond that picture, that inner picture, to compare it with the world as it actually is, to see whether that picture is accurate or not, or whether it represents anything, whether we're just dreaming and all there is the picture. And so, now for Berkeley, all there is the picture, but it's directly caused by God, so it's good. So at any rate, a view like Locke's ultimately led down the path to skepticism. So, okay. Well, that's what I'm going to do is